Okay, everyone, welcome to Race and Ethnic Inequality. And before we get into the subject matter of this chapter, I want to first cover some terminology that is not only relevant to the topics of race and ethnicity, but they are also quite relevant to the topics of gender stratification inequality and also social class inequality. But this terminology, traditionally appears in this chapter. And so that's why I haven't talked about it just yet. But hopefully as we cover this material in this lecture, you'll begin to think of how this might apply to the topics of gender and race. I'm trying to set my timer. Okay, so here we go. So this terminology can be found, let me get the book out, on page 344. So if you want to turn to page 344, you can begin to cover this material. So again, this is in the chapter on race and ethnicity. Okay, and again, traditionally, historically, this terminology is applied to race and ethnicity. But again, you'll see, I think, how this can apply to both gender and social class. So we want to start out at the bottom, this idea of stereotype. Stereotype is a simplified description applied to every person in some category. So notice here that we're talking about people being in a category. So for example, I am a white, not only am I white, but I'm male. So what are the stereotypes that maybe people have of me because I'm white? And what kind of stereotypes do they have of me because I'm male? Are those exclusive from one another? Okay, being white versus being male, or those, one category in and of itself, white male. Okay, so we're going to start there, a simplified description. So, and then we move on up the ladder, and that's how I've designed these. I've put these going from something as more micro level sociology at the bottom with stereotype, and then on up the ladder to the macro level. But the next item up the ladder there is prejudice, a rigid and unfair generalization about an entire category of people. So we start out with stereotype, largely I'm going to move this down just a little bit. We start out with stereotype being something more of kind of a value judgment, an attitude, a belief about things. And then prejudice starts to move up the ladder of inequality and start thinking about how we judge people. So stereotypes are more like ideas that we have, okay, of people. And we lump people into categories of people. And once we start lumping people, individuals, into larger categories, then that's where there can be some issues associated with prejudice and discrimination. So discrimination is going to be the unequal treatment of various categories of people. Let me point something out about this. I've been trying to organize this in such a way to show you something. So, all right, let's think about this way, okay? So we've got, where is it, over here? Is it over this way? Yeah. We have stereotype and prejudice. This is more at that micro level, right? And so we want to think about this in terms of, again, ideas, values, beliefs about people. And it's from those values, ideas, and beliefs about people that moves us into this behavior. And that is what separates stereotype and prejudice from discrimination, okay? Discrimination is the actual behavior. And that's where an exercise of power comes into play. We discriminate against people based upon what we believe and think about these, okay? Now then, as you're going to see here in just a second, these are more associated, the stereotype and prejudice are more about the individual level. And this is where we're talking about social interaction. And so that is something of a small group phenomenon, right? Individuals interacting with one another, okay? And this is done at that individual level. Prejudice, discrimination are done at that individual level. How do I think about somebody else? And what is it that influences my thinking about that person? Okay? Is it because they are part of a certain category? Now, let's talk about that just a little bit more. This might sound kind of odd, but I want you to consider this. Part of, we've talked about this also in the chapters prior to our break, but in the chapters on socialization and the chapters on social interaction, okay? Specifically in the chapter on socialization, we talk about the importance of interacting with those that are around us. And we talk about the importance of significant others. What role do significant others play in our lives? They are our direct contact, okay? But what do we think about people that are not in our inner circle? How do we think about people that we don't know? And we talked about that being a generalized other, okay? We've also talked about how do we move people that we don't know into that spectrum of being significant others, into people that we do know. And as we start thinking about that, we realize there's only a handful of people that we consider significant others. Most everybody else is a generalized other. And what is generalized other? A cultural norm, a stranger. That's what stereotype also is. So how do we know people that we don't know? What image do we have of people that we've not had a chance to interact with? So what I like to tell people, students, is don't beat yourself up over stereotypes. Stereotypes are part of being human. Now, once we start using those stereotypes as an exercise of power and prejudice and discrimination, that's where we can get into the realm of morality and ethics and right and wrong, and maybe we should treat people the way that we want to be treated. But this idea that stereotypes in and of themselves are necessarily bad, I would encourage you not to beat yourself up over that, especially if you don't want to stereotype other people. If you see yourself as a really nice person and you want to treat people fairly and equal, and of course in the United States that's something that's written into the law in this country, equality, okay? But, you know, stereotypes are part of being human. How do I know that those people are any different than what my idea is until I have that interaction and that sort of thing? Well, there's ways to break down stereotypes. Interacting with people of that category, so to speak, is a way of breaking down stereotypes. We could study the experience of others. So there's ways that we can break down stereotypes. But in and of itself, stereotypes are very much a fundamental part of being human. Okay. Now, the question that we want to start to think about. Let me advance this to the next slide. And we're going to come back to the material on the board here in just a second. But what we want to think about is how stereotype and prejudice play at that individual level, okay? And then what is the importance of an institutionalized version of stereotype and prejudice? What is the importance of an institutionalized version of discrimination? Okay? And that's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So, most of us can identify with the idea that, being prejudiced and discriminatory to somebody that is different than us is not the best of things. And in this chapter, that would be considered racism. Okay? Discriminating against an individual because they are of a category, a certain racial category. Now, before we go into institutional prejudice and discrimination, what's discrimination called based upon gender? That's called sexism. What is discrimination based upon if you're in a certain social class? Do we discriminate against people if they're poor? Do we discriminate against people who have less power? That's called classism. Okay? So racism is tied to discrimination associated with race. Sexism is discrimination tied to associations of different sexual preference, perhaps, or even gender. Classism is associated with being of a different class. Usually classism is the wealthy discriminating against people that are poor. Because, again, discrimination has got to do with power and how we treat people. Okay? But here's the next thing that I want to go into, this idea of institutional prejudice. Now, let me back up and let's look at these definitions here. Okay? This notion of institutional prejudice. So, beliefs and ideas built into the functioning of the operation of an organization. Okay. Now, again, most of us can relate to this idea of how we treat one another. Okay? And that's where prejudice and discrimination could come into play. What is the problem if organizations have prejudice built into how they function? What is the problem? Look on the very top there. What is the problem if institutions discriminate? The discrimination is built into the practice of an institution, the actual policies, and perhaps laws. Okay? Now, here's why this is particularly more problematic. All right? So, let me look at the next slide here. Okay, think about this right here. All right, so actually, let's back up one. All right, let's look at this one more time. Okay, so now, what do we mean by social institutions and organizations? Okay, so let's say that I interact with you in a certain way, okay, and maybe my beliefs and ideas and values are changed about people of your category based upon my interaction with you. Now, what's really at play here is that individuals are different from one another, right? Not all individuals are the same. But we use this notion of labels and social status and categories to be able to interact with people that we don't know. And this is why it's quite common that if you have, and you may not even know that you have this, but if you have a stereotype or a prejudice about an entire category of people, and then you meet somebody of that category, you start to realize, oh, those people aren't the way that I thought, and your stereotypes and your prejudices start to break down. And what's going on there, again, is you're interacting with an individual, right? And that interaction is starting to influence, that experience is starting to influence how you think about people of that category. Now, just because somebody is of a category doesn't mean that all people of that category are the same person. So this is a very interesting dynamic, as you can start to realize. So, again, we know that this is the prejudice and stereotype are much more of this level of thinking right here, okay? What influence do social structures like government, social institutions like government, school, work, perhaps religion, and we could go on and think about that a little bit further. So if these institutions are adopting policies of prejudice and discrimination, what is particularly more problematic about this is that this influences this down here. Not only does the social interaction influence what we think about one another, okay, but if we have institutional prejudice and institutional discrimination up here at the structural level, now we're talking about the framing of society. And here, so in a one-to-one interaction, it's just me and you, right? And we work out our beliefs about each other and our ideas about each other based upon our interaction. Okay? What is particularly problematic about institutional prejudice and institutional discrimination is that now it's not just you and me. We both, let me extend my timer. Okay? So not only are we talking about you and me, but we are both under the institution of government. So not only are your beliefs and attitudes affected by my interaction and vice versa, both of our attitudes of each other are influenced under that umbrella of the institution. So for example, whether you agree with this or not, a law that discriminates against people based upon gender and marriage. So let's say that people that are homosexual want to get married, but the government says that you cannot do that. It's not recognized under the law. So how does that policy not only affect me if I'm homosexual, that I can't get married with somebody else that's of the same sex, but how does that policy of government affect other people's ideas, beliefs, and attitudes about me as being homosexual? So those people are not even interacting with me and don't know who I am as a person, but because the law is as such, how does that influence people's values, attitudes, beliefs, behavior, how they interact with people that are like me or that are not like me? This becomes reinforced. So when institutions have certain practices that are more prejudicial or more discriminatory, that is particularly more problematic because it doesn't just affect the people that are of that type, it affects everybody else as well. And it becomes the norm. It becomes acceptable. Again, remember we talked about how policy and law can affect norms, and how these things here, values, attitudes, beliefs, ideas, interaction with others, how these also affect norms and policies in some cases. Okay? So that is a brief introduction to thinking about these terminologies of stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, institutional prejudice, and institutional discrimination. And this will help you to better understand race and ethnicity in terms of the interactions according to race, ethnicity, and inequality. But not just race and ethnicity, but hopefully you begin to think about this as it pertains to gender and how it pertains to social class.